This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're really glad you're joining us today because we've got a pretty fascinating analytical exercise on the docket.
We really do.
Yeah, if you've ever found yourself staring at just a massive, intimidating stack of historical economic theory and thought, I wish someone would just distill this down to the actual structural mechanics, well, you are in the right place.
Absolutely the right place.
Today, we are unpacking a highly specific, incredibly concise set of notes. This document summarizes 10 core concepts from Karl Marx's iconic and, frankly, gigantic 19th century work, Capital.
Often known as Das Kapital, yeah.
Right, Das Kapital.
It's an incredibly dense piece of historical literature. But what makes the notes you provided so uniquely valuable is their highly analytical structure. Like, we are doing a history lesson today.
No, definitely not.
We're looking at a document that strips these 10 concepts down to their bare metal using a 3-part framework.
Right, it's like a report card.
Exactly like a report card. First, the notes provide a simple mechanical explanation of the original concept. Second, they assign a today's validity score, effectively grading how relevant the underlying structural observation remains right now.
Which is the coolest part.
Yeah, and third, they explain exactly how modern mainstream economics has either adapted the idea, entirely rewritten its mechanics, or just thrown it out completely.
It really functions like a rigorous historical audit. It's the perfect shortcut for you to get a firm grasp on a notoriously heavy topic without, drowning in 19th century prose. But before we get into the actual grading and the structural comparisons,
We need to set the parameters.
we need to set the parameters for how we are handling this text.
We absolutely do, because this material touches on the foundational roots of economic systems and deals with theories that are inherently politically charged. It's crucial that we state clearly right up front, we are not taking sides. We are not endorsing and we are not condemning any of the economic systems or viewpoints we discussed today. Our objective is purely analytical. We're here to unpack the specific source material you provided and impartially report on how these historical concepts stack up against modern economic frameworks based strictly on these notes.
Strictly on the notes.
We are looking at the mechanics of the theories, nothing more.
Let's get right into those mechanics then. I think the most logical place to start is with the observations that actually scored incredibly well on this audit. The structural realities that survived the test of time.
Enduring realities.
Yeah. The notes highlight several concepts where the today's validity is ranked as high or very high, meaning modern economics broadly agrees with the underlying observation, even if the math has changed.
Right.
The very first concept deals with the dual nature of commodities. The original text posits that every product has a split identity. It possesses utility or use value, and it possesses an exchange value that allows it to be traded.
And capitalism really prioritizes that sellability, that exchange value.
Exactly. And the notes give this a very high validity score, noting that modern economics fully embraces this duality, but it completely overhauls the terminology and the plumbing behind it.
Modern economics essentially takes that dual architecture and applies a much more granular mathematical lens to it. When economists today talk about the ability to trade a commodity, what the original text called exchange value, they're simply talking about price.
Just the price tag.
Just the price.
Yeah.
And price isn't an inherent fixed quality of the object. It's a dynamic metric determined by the constant friction between supply and demand.
Okay. And what about the other side? The use value.
On the other side of the equation, the concept of use value has evolved into the modern concept of utility.
Yeah.
Modern frameworks quantify subjective consumer preference. They look at how much satisfaction or benefit you derive from a product and specifically focus on marginal utility.
Marginal utility meaning?
The benefit you get from consuming just one additional unit of that product.
That shift from a fixed inherent value to a subjective dynamic value is massive. I mean, it explains the classic paradox of value, right?
The diamond and water paradox, yeah.
Yeah, why a diamond, which has very little practical use value for human survival, carries a massive exchange value or price, while water, which is essential for life, is incredibly cheap. Modern economics uses marginal utility and scarcity to solve that paradox, rather than assuming the value is baked into the object itself.
Precisely. The duality remains, but the underlying engine dictating those values is completely different. And this natural drive to assign value in trade commodities leads directly into another concept that scores very high validity in your notes.
Point 5, capital as self-expanding value.
Yes. The original observation essentially personifies capital. describing its core function as the relentless pursuit of its own growth. Capital doesn't just sit idle. Its entire purpose within the system is to be deployed to create more capital.
Right, the money wants to grow. And when you look at modern corporate finance, this is essentially the foundational rule of the game.
It is the game.
The notes explicitly point out that modern economics just rebrands this innate drive. Instead of calling it self-expanding value, modern frameworks operate on the principle of profit maximization or shareholder value maximization.
Think about your own retirement portfolio or index funds.
Exactly. You don't put your money into the market so it can sit in a digital vault. You expect the executive boards of those companies to deploy that capital aggressively to capture market share, innovate, and ultimately return a larger sum to you. The system requires that initial investment to continuously compound.
And that compounding requirement is what necessitates the next highly validated concept in the notes, the circulation of capital.
The cycle. Invest, produce, sell, reinvest.
That's the one. The original text meticulously charted that physical and financial cycle of business. You invest capital, you produce a commodity, you sell that commodity, and you immediately reinvest the proceeds to start the cycle over at a larger scale.
And the notes give this a high validity score, too.
Very high. The notes recognize that modern macroeconomic models are in absolute lockstep with this observation. In modern terms, we look at the circular flow of national income.
The entire global economy relies on the kinetic energy of that circulation. If that flow stops, if consumers stop buying or banks stop lending or supply chains break down and halt production, the system seizes up.
We saw exactly what that looks like during major liquidity crises or global shutdowns. The observation that capital must maintain a constant velocity to survive is a shared, undeniable truth in both the historical text and modern microeconomics.
Okay, so this constant circulation and requirement for growth naturally dictates the scale of the players involved in the market, which brings us to another concept, the notes rate with high validity.
The concentration of capital.
Right, big business. The original premise is that as this cycle of investment and reinvestment continues, there's an inherent structural tendency for capital to pool. Large companies will inevitably absorb smaller ones, leading to massive, concentrated corporate power.
And anyone observing the landscape of modern multinational corporations would find it hard to argue against that reality.
The observation of the outcome is completely accurate, but modern economics provides a much more technical explanation for the why, right?
It does, and more importantly, it changes how we respond to it. Modern frameworks analyze this concentration through mechanisms like economies of scale, where the sheer volume of production drives down the cost per unit, allowing massive firms to easily underprice small competitors.
And network effects, too.
Yes, network effects are incredibly relevant today. Think about massive tech or social media platforms. The service becomes exponentially more valuable solely because everyone else is already using it, creating an impenetrable moat against new competition.
But this is where the modern approach diverges from the historical assumption of inevitability.
Exactly.
Rather than viewing this concentration as an unstoppable, fatal flaw of the system, modern economic frameworks treat it as a structural hazard that requires active management.
This is the entire basis for competition policy. Regulatory bodies utilize antitrust laws, merger reviews, and monopoly regulations to actively suppress or break up this concentration when it begins to stifle market efficiency.
So it's viewed as a manageable market failure rather than a predetermined endpoint.
That distinction between fatal flaw and manageable metric is a recurring theme in how modern economics processes these old theories.
Which perfectly segues into the labor market. Let's look at the concept of labor power as a commodity. The original theory argues that individuals, lacking their own means to produce goods, are forced to sell their working capacity, their labor power, in a marketplace in exchange for a wage.
And the notes grant this a high validity score because labor is undeniably traded in a market.
But the modern interpretation of how that transaction is valued fundamentally reshapes the entire relationship.
The shift in perspective here cannot be overstated. The historical text views this dynamic inherently as an exploitative structure, where the wage is simply the minimum required to keep the worker functioning.
Just basic survival.
Right. But modern economics strips away that inherent moral framing. Instead, it determines wages based on the marginal productivity of labor. In a modern framework, labor is categorized clinically as one of several input factors of production, functioning alongside capital, land, and technology.
To put that in highly practical terms for you listening, when you sit down for a performance review to negotiate your salary, You aren't calculating your biological baseline for survival.
No, you're not.
Nor are you calculating the sheer volume of physical calories you expended. You're arguing your marginal productivity. You're making a case for how much additional revenue or efficiency your specific skills brought to the firm.
Modern economics views the labor market as a transaction where the price of labor fluctuates based on the value of the final output that labor helped generate, balanced against the supply of workers with similar skills.
And that reliance on output and market demand to determine value leads us directly into the most significant departure in the entire document.
The Great Divergence.
Yes, we are entering the territory where the today's validity scores in your notes plummet to low or medium. This is where modern economics fundamentally rejects the foundational mechanics of the original text.
The core of this divergence is the complete rejection of the labor theory of value.
The notes explicitly identify this as the single biggest modification in the evolution of economic thought. The original labor theory of value posits that the fundamental root of a commodity's price is entirely derived from the amount of labor time required to make it. Under that theory, labor is the singular source of all new value in an economy.
And the notes rank the modern validity of this as low, noting it's entirely absent from mainstream modern economics. Mainstream economics wholly rejects the idea that labor time inherently creates value.
Give us an example of how that works.
We can look at this through a simple thought experiment. If an individual spends 10,000 hours meticulously constructing an incredibly complex, highly engineered machine that absolutely no one wants, needs, or has any use for, the modern market dictates that the value of that machine is zero. The immense labor input is totally irrelevant if there's no demand.
Value isn't injected into the product by the sweat of the worker. Value is determined at the point of exchange by the consumer. Modern economics dictates that price is the result of a highly complex, multivariable equation.
It involves consumer demand, the scarcity of the resources used, the technological leverage applied during production, and the overall structure of the market. The labor theory of value has been completely replaced.
And because modern economics discards that theory, it creates a cascading effect that forces the rejection of the next major concept in the notes, the source of surplus value.
Right. The original text relies on a very stark mathematical equation.
Yeah.
It argues that because labor is the only source of value, any profit a capitalist makes must be the direct result of extracting surplus value from the worker.
So the value the worker creates minus the wage they are paid equals the profit.
Exactly. Profit, in this view, is structurally identical to unpaid labor.
But when you remove the premise that labor is the sole creator of value, that equation instantly falls apart. The notes give this a medium validity score because modern economics obviously acknowledges that firms generate profit, but it entirely rewrites the source code of where that profit comes from.
Modern economists view profit as a multifaceted reward system. It's analyzed as the return on several crucial non-labor inputs. First and foremost, it is the market's reward for absorbing financial risk.
Taking a chance.
Right. When a founder leverages their assets to launch a firm risking total bankruptcy, the subsequent profit is the premium for taking on that massive uncertainty. Furthermore, profit is driven by the marginal productivity of capital itself.
Meaning the tools and tech.
Yes. The advanced robotics, the proprietary software, the highly optimized supply chain infrastructure, these tools inherently multiply the output of the human worker. Modern economics attributes a significant portion of the value created to the machinery and the technological innovation, rather than exclusively to the human hands operating the system.
Or profit can also simply be a structural inefficiency, like the capture of monopoly rent when a company corners a market. The key takeaway for you is that modern economics views profit as a complex cocktail of risk premium, capital productivity, and market positioning.
It explicitly rejects the idea that it's exclusively extracted from the workforce. And this fundamental disagreement over the mechanics of value and profit totally alters how modern economists view the supposed fatal flaws of the capitalist system.
Which brings us to part 4, the flaws in the machine. The final sections of your source notes deal with the systemic cracks in the foundation: unemployment, falling profit rates, and inherent systemic contradictions.
The original text views these not as temporary hiccups, but as inevitable, escalating crises that will ultimately tear the system apart.
But modern economics assigns all of these a medium validity. It acknowledges their existence as persistent realities, but analyzes them as manageable frictions within a complex machine. Take the concept of the structural generation of unemployment.
The original thought frames unemployment almost as a deliberate, necessary feature of the system, a reserve army of labor required to keep wages suppressed and workers compliant.
But modern economics categorizes the causes technically, right? Stripping away the framing of an intentional exploitation structure. We never see a true 0% unemployment rate, obviously.
No, we don't. Modern frameworks divide this friction into specific quantifiable categories. We look at frictional unemployment, which is simply the natural lag time when individuals are transitioning between jobs or entering the workforce.
Just the time spent job hunting.
Exactly. And more significantly, we look at structural unemployment. If a massive leap in artificial intelligence suddenly renders an entire sector of administrative jobs obsolete, those workers possess skills that no longer match the jobs available.
The structural mismatch.
Yes. Modern economics views this as a friction point, requiring robust fiscal policy, retraining programs, and central bank management, rather than evidence of the system's impending collapse.
We see that exact same shift from inevitable doom to manageable cycle when the notes examine the tendency of the profit rate to fall. The historical theory argued that as competing firms constantly invest heavier and heavier amounts of capital into machinery to outprice each other, the overall efficiency of that investment must inevitably grind downward towards zero,
Suffocating the economy over time. But this assumption severely underestimated the boundless nature of human innovation. Modern economics rejects this as an inevitable law of decline.
Profit rates can be recovered, right?
Absolutely. While it's true that profit margins within a specific hyper-competitive maturing industry will eventually compress, the macro-level profit rate of the entire economy doesn't follow a doomed trajectory.
The modern framework points to powerful reset buttons built into the system. Technological breakthroughs don't just optimize old factories, they create entirely new, massively profitable industries out of thin air.
Furthermore, the constant opening of new global markets and the development of entirely new asset classes continually refresh the potential for high-margin returns.
Which perfectly sets up the final concept in the notes, capitalism's inherent contradictions. The original text highlights massive, unresolvable clashes built into the architecture, like the friction between an economy's ability to produce an infinite amount of consumer goods clashing against the unequal distribution of wealth that limits the population's ability to actually buy those goods.
Modern economics certainly doesn't deny that these imbalances cause severe disruptions. However, the modification here is fundamentally about the assumed trajectory.
Right, they aren't fatal.
Exactly. Modern frameworks analyze these clashes as market failures or the painful contractions within normal business cycles. When production outpaces consumption capacity, we experience a recession.
It's painful, it causes massive disruption.
But modern economic theory argues it's a cyclical reset, not a fatal contradiction that heralds the end of the economic model.
Okay, we've navigated through the mechanics of all 10 concepts, and it's time to synthesize this historical audit. Based strictly on the overall summary provided in your source notes, what's the ultimate scorecard? When we strip away the 19th century rhetoric, how much of this massive theory actually survived the jump into modern mainstream economics?
The source notes distill the scorecard into 4 distinct outcomes.
Let's hear them.
First, the structural and institutional observations, the dual nature of commodities, the relentless expansion of capital, the necessity of circulation, and the tendency toward corporate concentration remain highly relevant. Modern economics essentially absorbed these observations as the baseline reality of corporate behavior.
Okay, that's one.
Second, the fundamental engine of the original theory, the labor theory of value and the explanation of surplus value, has been thoroughly rejected and placed by subjective value and marginal productivity.
Point 3.
Third, the mechanistic law predicting the inevitable fall of profit rates has been heavily discounted due to the unpredictable nature of technological innovation.
And the fourth outcome.
Finally, the overarching prophecy that these systemic frictions will inevitably result in the catastrophic collapse of the system is completely absent from modern economic thought.
The notes offer a brilliant single-sentence encapsulation of this entire exercise. Modern economics absorbed a great deal of the original institutional observations, but it completely threw out the value theories and inevitable laws.
That really is the ultimate cheat sheet.
It is. It's fascinating to realize that the structural skeleton of how we view supply chains, corporate growth, and market concentration relies on observations made over a century ago, even as the mathematical formulas we use to manage them have been completely rewritten.
It's a remarkable evolution of thought. And as we conclude, analyzing that specific shift, the absorption of the observations, but the complete rejection of the inevitable loss, presents a highly provocative structural questions for you to consider.
What's the takeaway?
We saw today how modern economics kept the structural observations but completely changed the terminology, swapping out emotionally heavy terms like contradictions and exploitation for clinical terms like market failures and marginal productivity.
That shifts the entire dynamic of the system.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, if we absorb the mechanics of the old theories but sanitize the language, how much does the vocabulary we use to describe our economy change how we actually feel about participating in it every day?
That is a phenomenal lens to view the news through the next time you hear about a central bank adjusting rates or a new regulatory policy being drafted. You are watching the managers actively patching the machine, but described with very clean vocabulary.
It really reframes everything.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope unpacking these source notes helped demystify some incredibly complex macroeconomic architecture and give you a sharper, more analytical perspective on the systems operating all around you. Keep wondering, keep analyzing the structures in your daily life, and we will catch you next time.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.